So these are going to be the best decks to climb with in July. The new season starts today, and I hope you guys are ready because this is a tier list brought to you by Hype Horizon. Link in the description. All of the deck codes are there, and it is made by all of our high legend players, whether it be GMs, high legend grinders, or content creators such as myself. We've come up with the best list for you, and the first deck on this list is going to be Big Spell Mage. It's been getting better and better with time because it used to be kind of a meme, but as the meta's been slowing down, as a lot of very powerful things have been getting nerfed, this deck has just slowly risen up bit by bit. And now with the addition of 40 HP, 40 card decks, which are pretty greedy most of the time, you're able to more reliably cheese out big spells using Belinda and Barbaric Sorceress. You can potentially disrupt your opponents with Barbaric Sorceress, Far Watch Post, as well as Blade Master Okani, because again, people are playing greedier decks. If you're playing against some aggro decks, you still have a lot of 4-cost and lower cards like the Pelican Diver and or Varden that can either remove things on the board or freeze the board entirely. And then you got really good late game with an infinitely scaling hero power, as well as a ton of big spells that you can then recast with the Grey Sage Parrot. This deck is just good at most stages of the game, and because again the meta is slowing down a little bit, you're never really at risk at dying super duper early anymore. So I know that I just said that not a lot of decks are going to kill you super quickly. That's why Big Spell Mage is strong now. But ironically enough, Fell Demon Hunter is actually the next best deck on this list, because apparently 40 HP is not enough to save you from Demon Hunter, which is absolutely ridiculous, first of all. But second of all, it kind of makes sense because people are running slightly greedier decks because they feel safer with that extra 10 HP. So since people are running greedier decks, they're not going to have as much reliable removal or board presence, which means things like Metamorphin, the Vicious Slither Spear, the Vanguard can snowball really quickly, Sigil of Alacrity and Fossil Fanatic get you a lot of extra card draw early, so you're just able to keep piling on pressure. And using those two things, you're able to get to your late game where you play either Kurtrus, Xylag, or Jace, and you can pretty easily close out the game. It's actually still surprisingly a really good deck despite being nerfed like 2 or 3 times and having a card come out that literally has a built-in counter to this card. Despite all of that, it's still a top tier deck, and I would recommend trying it out because it's also pretty simple to play for anybody who's picking up the game. The next deck on this list is going to be Control Warrior. And I know what you're thinking, this deck was obliterated like 2 weeks ago. How is this possibly a top deck? Well, Luna Love hit rank 1 legend using Control Warrior by taking out the cards that were destroyed. Nelly is unplayable garbage that you all probably should have dusted if you had it. And From the Depths is still playable, but not nearly as efficient as it used to be. So Luna Love put together a build with a little bit more removal and armor gain with things like Rancor and the Igneous Lava Gorger, and revolves a little bit more around dragons and Kazakusan for a late game finisher, as opposed to trying to cheese out wins with Mr. Smite as well as Nelly. So now this deck scales really well into the late game, which it already did pretty well. It has just as much, if not more, armor than it used to have, and it's able to out armor and control the board against a lot of the aggro decks and outscale a lot of the other control decks, especially if they run 40 cards, because they're not going to super reliably get to all of their best cards before you get to Kazakusan. So honestly, this deck's just in a really good spot, and I would highly recommend trying it out. If you don't have some of the legendaries, you can replace some stuff with things like another Rancor, another Brawl for some removal, or you can run something like Restaurant Viper or Smothering Starfish or Okani to try to disrupt your opponent. So the next deck on this list is Buff Paladin, or really, really expensive Paladin, whatever you want to call it. And basically this deck just, dear God, this is expensive. Wow, so I just, looking at it again, I'm like, half of the deck is legendaries. Anyway, the reason why this deck is strong is because it's basically like a better version of Mech Paladin. You still have a decent amount of draw, but you're able to have a lot more flexible, just in general, good units, like the Overlord Rune Thack to pump up a decent number of minions in your hand. You also have things like the Catacomb Guard, which is just a way of dealing with minions on board while putting out a big minion yourself. Not to mention the fact that you have the potential finisher of Mr. Smite that you could pump in your hand a ton. Honestly, this deck is just really good. There's not really much to say about it. It's just a tempo deck with a lot of really high value, big legendaries, and a pretty decent early game, so you're not going to get overrun. It's a pretty simple deck, very expensive though, but if you have the cards, or at least most of the cards, give it a shot. So the next deck on this list is going to be Boat Rogue, and I will say that the jackpot version of Rogue is very close in power level, but I do think it's a little bit worse just because it relies on RNG to do well, and it just feels bad where if you just generate nothing good, you'll lose the game. And this version of the deck just feels a little bit snappier. You're able to have a little bit more tempo. You have more burst because of Mr. Smite and the Fillet Fighter, as well as Gone Fishing with the Asharan Vessel, which can be anywhere from 12 to 15 burst damage for 8 or 9 mana. It just feels a little bit faster. And so overall, I think that this deck is able to punish the 40 card, 40 HP decks a little bit harder than the Jackpot Rogue is able to. But again, both of them are good. They're very close in power level. I would just personally recommend this one slightly. Now, the next deck on this list is one that I personally hate because it relies on Celestial Alignment. And this is a card that everybody already knows that I hate. However, I can't say that it's not good. I'm gonna be honest with you guys. You're able to have 40 extra HP, which allows you to more reliably ramp up. And if you're able to more reliably ramp up and get to Celestial Alignment, you're more reliably able to get to all of your big dudes right here. And then eventually closing the game out by playing Kazakhstan, drawing some cards, and playing Celestial Alignment again. Overall, the deck is just really, really good. It's not a style of play that I like. In fact, it's one that I actively dislike. But you can't deny the fact that this deck is probably the best Druid deck right now. So the next deck on this list is going to be Control Shaman because it deals with the 3 main archetypes very well. Against aggro, you've got things like Schooling, Cheap Removal, and a Murloc package that can help you control the board. You have Snowfall Guardian, which helps you against the more mid-range matchups that are board focused. And against control decks that have like big bombs they want to play late game, you got Mutanus, which can sometimes eat either the big bombs or things like Kazakhstan, which can completely shut down a deck like Druid. And the only weakness of this deck is it loses to ticking time bomb decks, I call them, like Boar Priest and Naval Mine Rogue. But those decks are not doing very well right now, so its biggest weakness is doing bad, and it does really well against basically everything else. So the next deck on the list is Mech Paladin, or as I like to call it, the cheaper, a little bit worse younger brother of Buff Paladin. And basically that name sums up what this deck does. It's basically, it runs similarly to Buff Paladin, and you just kind of buff up things in your hand and draw minions and play tempo. But your late game is obviously a lot worse because you don't have as many legendaries, and even your mid game's a little bit worse because you don't have as many flexible like rush cards. But it's still a very good deck, especially if you're playing on more of a budget. I think it's one of the better budget decks out there right now. So I'd definitely still give it a chance. But yeah, it's just a worse version of Buff Paladin. Next on the list is going to be Murloc Shaman. This deck is doing fairly well because the 40 card decks are a little bit greedy and can't really deal with a massively snowballing Murloc Shaman board sometimes. And if they're not able to deal with it immediately and you can pump everything up with No Fin Can Stop Us, you can sometimes close out games even if your opponent has that 40 HP. So it's basically just a snowballing deck that relies on playing against a slightly greedier deck. Not to mention the fact that if you're playing against something more aggressive, you can sometimes surprise them by playing Clownfish and then Flurgle and a couple of other Murlocs, which can completely shut down a more aggressive deck, especially if they have a ton of minions that are like 1 or 2 HP. So this deck is basically good into anything that's not hard control, and the only hard control decks out there right now are Control Warrior and kind of Control Shaman, and other than that, this deck will do pretty well against most things. Also, if they don't have the removal, if you're playing against a control deck, you can close out the game really fast and suddenly with cards like Bloodlust. So the last 2 decks on this list are the tier 3 decks, which are basically decks that are good, have the potential to be good, but are either really high skill cap or only good into a niche like selection of decks, so it's very meta dependent. Yeah, overall, Boar Priest is still fairly decent if you know what you're doing. You need to get the combo 100% correctly to kill 2 boars and then 3 boars with the Wild Pyromancer still out there. And then you get to re-equip the weapon with Xyrella, and you can do up to 90 damage while completely shutting your opponent out of the game, which is pretty good. So overall, the deck is still solid. It's just not nearly as good as it used to be, and it's also hard to play, so new players should probably avoid this deck. And the last deck on the list is going to be one of my old favorite decks, and that's Naga Mage. I used to love playing this deck. I was like 20-4 with it. I thought it was really, really strong. And then they nerfed the Spite Lash Siren. But then, once they came out with the new 40 HP, 40 card legendary, the Prince Renathal, basically it slowed down the meta enough to where the nerf was kind of negated. Like, old turn 5 is new turn 6 in this current meta right now, and because of that, you're able to still pretty reliably pop off with this card now. You're not going to do super well against aggro, like Naga Demon Hunter is still good, and Murloc Shaman now has 1 extra turn to snowball and kill you, so that's gonna be rough. It's definitely worse than it was before, but because those 40 card decks do slow down the meta a little bit, if you're playing against one of those decks or a more control focused deck, you're able to get to your big power play, get to your infinitely scaling hero power to beat some of the more control based decks, and overall, I think it's still pretty solid. But again, like Boar Priest, it's a little bit hard to play. It doesn't have as much return on investment as some of the other simpler decks that are just higher win rate in general. So overall, it's up to you whether or not you want to play it, but it is pretty fun. A lot of decisions have to be made on like 1 or 2 turns on turn 6 or 7, depending on when you play the Siren. And yeah, that's basically it for the tier list. I hope you guys enjoyed. This is the Hype Horizon tier list. Again, link in the description. It'll have every single one of the codes that you need from this tier list. And I hope you guys enjoyed. We're trying to increase the number of decks on the tier list from about 6. We jumped it up to 11 this time. Let us know what you think about that, because we could try to keep it around 10 for the future so you guys have more decks to choose from. And yeah, that's about it. Hopefully you guys enjoy the video, and I'll see you in the next one.